was the former First Minister of Scotland. I am currently still a member of the Scottish Parliament for Glasgow Pollock and father of three wonderful girls and all-round troublemaker, to be honest.
Why did you enter politics and why did you make the SNP your home?
So I was 16 at the time when 9/11 happened, and that was a day that had huge consequences, obviously, primarily, unfortunately, and tragically for those that suffered a loss of a loved one. But thousands of miles away for myself and people like me, Muslims living in the West, it was a really seminal moment when I went to school. I was being bombarded by questions around why do Muslims hate America? Why did Muslims fly planes into the Twin Towers? Do you know where bin Laden is? All these questions that came in the days and the weeks and the months thereafter, and we were expected to know the answer when, of course, we knew nothing more than the people who were asking the question. So, from that moment, I decided, look, I'm going to watch the news with my dad. My dad would always watch Channel 4 News, 7 p.m. Jon Snow. He'd stick it on every single night, and I'd never really bothered to watch it. But that post 9/11, I thought I'm going to get myself a bit educated on what's going on in the world. And really, I became fascinated by it all and chose to study politics and became part of the student movement against the Iraq War in 2003 and thereafter. And I suppose to cut a long story short, joined the SNP in 2004 when, to me, I suppose the obvious question was in relation to the Iraq War, why are Scottish sons and daughters being sent to fight in a war that we profoundly disagreed with as a country? And to me, that was the real kind of, again, penny dropping moment in terms of Scottish independence. And the Scottish National Party was the party for me and has been since then. And I've had the privilege of being a member, being elected, and of course, leading the party for a period as well.
How did it feel being the first person of colour, first South Asian, first second generation immigrant, and the first Muslim to be the First Minister of Scotland?
It's never been a question of me of choosing one identity over the other. I've been obviously a very proud Scotsman, as you'd imagine, born here, bred here, raised here, educated here, raising three wonderful girls here, and have a family home here. At the same time, although Pakistan's only a country I've been to on a couple of occasions, it's a country that has a very special place in my heart. And I think the wonderful thing that we should be celebrating, but I'm afraid, and I'm sure we might talk about this, that has become more difficult, is that we should be celebrating that people can have many identities. You know, you shouldn't have to choose being perhaps in your case being British or being Pakistani, in my case being Scottish or Pakistani. You shouldn't have to choose one over the other. Actually, you can be really proud and celebrate the fact that you have heritage of both. It was an incredible honor and something I'll be proud of for my whole life. Not because just of what I was able to achieve, although of course, you take pride in your personal achievements. It's more so that the amount of people that came up to me afterwards to say that, well, we now can see somebody who looks like us in that position, and that gives us the inspiration to want to get involved in politics. And that's it. That is it in a nutshell. That whatever I've done in politics, and I've been really lucky to have had a number of firsts. I was the first Muslim in the Scottish government in the history of devolution, the first Muslim and Pakistani person of colour to ever win a constituency seat in the Scottish Parliament. So I've done a lot of firsts, and over the years, I've always thought to myself, you can have two approaches as a minority. You can either pull the ladder up behind you so nobody else gets up, or you can reach out your hand and pull other people up with you. And I've always wanted the latter. I've always wanted to bring other people with me. Really proud to have mentored Anam Gesser, who was an MP until the general election, sadly lost her seat. But she worked in my office, for example. I brought her into the party, kind of nurtured as much as I could. I mean, her successes are very much her own, but I was very keen to have some kind of mentoring role and play some kind of mentoring role to a number of people of different backgrounds and diversities, because I think it is important if you're in this position, you've got to bring people up alongside you.
How did you feel going into being First Minister, and what extra challenges did you face along the way?
It's a daunting task. I've been a government minister for a number of years, and I was lucky to serve in the Scottish Government for around 12 years in total, different roles: External Affairs Minister, Justice Secretary, Health Secretary. Transport Minister as well. So I understood the pressures of government, particularly in the role before First Minister, which was Health Secretary in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, it doesn't get too much more stressful, I think,
Yeah.
than that. So you go in knowing that there's a level of stress being First Minister, but you also know there's an incredible level of opportunity every single day. I mean, you are the one who gets to call the shots. You get to make the decisions. You get to make the change, the transformative change that you've been fighting for your kind of whole political life. And you get to represent your country in the world stage, whether it's at COP28 in Dubai or whether I was over in Brussels speaking to colleagues in the European Union. You know, you were representing Scotland, and that to me is a matter of great pride, as I say, as somebody who's very proud to be Scottish. In terms of challenges, numerous. I mean, I think probably the most significant challenge internally that I faced, and one that ultimately, to be honest, ended up in some way, even indirectly, leading to me having to step down, was that in politics, divided parties don't win elections, and we were a divided party. You know, we had a pretty difficult election leadership contest that I was involved in, and I always reflect on could I have done more to bring those other factions together. You know, I hope those in the other factions also think about whether they could have done more to support me as leader, and certainly I hope they're supporting my successor now in a way that they didn't get behind me. So I think for me the biggest challenge probably, I mean, you know, this day-to-day challenges is the biggest challenge. You know, the biggest issue in the inbox was the cost of living crisis and people's poverty. Internally, the biggest challenge was always going to be the divisions within the party.
Why did you choose to resign as First Minister? Do you have regrets?
I don't kind of simmer on regret too much. I think it's important to reflect on lessons, and you've got to learn those lessons for your next chapter in whatever life brings you. And I'm a great believer that things happen for a reason. A really great believer that I was meant to be in that position as First Minister for that period. And then it's time for the next person, in this case, John Swinney, to take over thereafter. I could have done things differently, of course. I could have. I think ending the Green Deal was the right thing to do because it was unfortunately having a negative impact, not just amongst, I think, our voters and supporters, but generally amongst my party. So it was the right thing to do. Probably I wouldn't have necessarily done it in the way that I did it back in the end of April, beginning of May. So there's definitely issues that I reflect on for sure. But I'm pretty philosophical, as I say. I think these things happen for a reason, and as I said in my resignation statement, I definitely don't bear any ill will or grudge towards anybody. What happened had to happen for a reason. I was able to make my mark, whether it was domestically or on the global stage on issues such as, for example, calling, you know, the first European leader to call for a ceasefire and continuing to call for a ceasefire over 300 days of a complete massacre in Gaza, and now extending to the West Bank. So, look, I'm very proud of what I was able to achieve domestically and internationally in that role, and now I've got full support behind the current First Minister.
Does this reflect that the mission for Scottish independence has gone for now?
I wouldn't say so. It's certainly a setback, the general election. I mean, the general election result, there's no way of sugarcoating it. The SNP took a thumping in that election. So that's clearly going to be a setback. Um, what we've got to do in party conferences this weekend, what the party has to do is really get back to talking about the issues that are important to the people that elected us in the first place. There has been a view for far too long that we've concentrated on issues that aren't of importance, that we've been too busy infighting, and divided parties, of course, don't win elections. But we are at our best when we're demonstrating that we are working in the interest of the people of Scotland. We are seen as unashamedly a pro-Scottish political party standing up for the Scottish interest. We've seen to have resiled from that in the eyes of the voter. So we've got to get back to winning that hard-won and hard-worked reputation. So look, it's a setback for sure. I can't deny that, but at the same time, even though the SNP took a hit during the general election, support for independence in the polls is still riding at around 50%. So there's a massive opportunity to capitalise on that.
Why has Palestine been such an important issue for you?
Always been a vocal proponent of, for example, a two-state solution. I have for a long time demanded an end to the occupation. It's not something that I've just started on October the 7th. It's an issue that's been close to my heart because the injustice that is faced by the Palestinian people and has been for over 75 years is in plain sight. It's for everybody to see. and the occupation has been long-standing, and those Palestinians have been long-suffering as a result of it. And Israel has acted for many decades with complete and utter impunity, no accountability under international law whatsoever. What happened October the 7th, and I've never made any bones about it, that the attack on October the 7th was a disgraceful attack and should be condemned by anybody of reasonable mind. At the same time, let's make no mistake about it. The response from Israel has gone far beyond any legitimate response. It is without a shadow of a doubt in breach of international law. And that is why prosecutors in the International Criminal Court are seeking an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, because in my mind, no doubt at all that he is responsible for egregious breaches of international law and war crimes. Of that, there could be little doubt. Many of your viewers, your listeners, your readers will know my in-laws were trapped in Gaza for 4 weeks, and what they saw when they were trapped in that war zone is beyond horrific. And we're compiling some of that evidence so we can present it to the International Criminal Court as eyewitness testimony to the war crimes that have been committed there.
Your time as First Minister coincides with Israel's assault on Gaza. How are you feeling during this time?
It was probably the most difficult 4 weeks of my life, and certainly of my wife's life. And we didn't know day to day whether my in-laws were going to survive or going to die, and if they're going to die in the most horrific and brutal manner possible. And that's not an easy thing to live with. I'm trying to support my wife as much as I can, given the absolute turmoil and how inconsolable she is. And of course, my children too. And we could shield my middle child, who was 4 at the time. We could shield her to a point. We couldn't shield my 15-year-old daughter, who was 14 at the time, because she knew exactly what was going on. She would see the news. She would be on social media. And she was extremely close, particularly to her granny. So there was a job to do as First Minister, which was to represent the values of my nation on a global stage, calling for a ceasefire, for example, an end to arms sales to Israel, and the recognition of the Palestinian state. And on the other side, of course, being a father and a husband to a wife who was, as I say, in absolute and complete turmoil. So that was a tricky moment. And at the same time, of course, through all of that, making sure that community tensions in Scotland didn't deepen or widen in any way, shape, or form. The Muslim community and Jewish community in Scotland have had a long history of interfaith engagement, but let's make no bones about it. What was happening and continues to happen in the Middle East was causing some fractions. And it was important for me to try to use my office to bring people together as much as I could.
What did you and your party do to support Palestine? And why do you think so many Western leaders are so reluctant to support Gaza?
So my party, I'm really proud the SNP has had a long-standing history of supporting the rights of the Palestinian people. Ultimately, this is not actually an issue of being pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. For me, the issue is about being pro-humanity and pro-international law. If you are pro-international law and you believe it should apply equitably, then it should apply to Israel as much as it should apply to, for example, Hamas, state parties and non-state parties. So if you believe in international law, it should apply equally to all. And you shouldn't pick and choose who international law applies to. If you do that, then you obviously have a certain agenda. And I'm afraid far too many in Europe, the UK, and the West have been seen to be completely and utterly one-sided. And I have to tell you, I talk to people, of course, members of the public in Scotland and across the UK, but I think about governments in the Muslim world and, in fact, beyond that, who believe that the Western position on Gaza has been full of double standard and hypocrisy. And they say to me, don't dare lecture us on human rights when 40,000 people, many innocent women, men, and children, have been killed. And you've done nothing. I mean, okay, you've released a statement, but you've done nothing. In fact, some countries like the United Kingdom are actively complicit by sending arms to Israel while there is an ongoing ICJ investigation into the war crime of genocide being committed. I mean, it's actually unconscionable. that we continue to send arms to that country. So, look, the Scottish government, even though I'm not there, my successor has been very vocal in saying that we continue to call for an arms embargo to Israel. We call for the immediate recognition of the Palestinian state. And of course, we call for a ceasefire so that humanitarian aid can get into Gaza. And of course, that the remaining hostages can be released and reunited with their loved ones.
What more can Western leaders do to help the people of Palestine?
Should be imposing sanctions on Israel. I mean, Israel has breached international law. There's no doubting that whatsoever. We've seen UN facilities bombed, hospitals bombed, schools bombed, children killed, water turned off, electricity turned off, collective punishment ensuing. Starvation is a weapon of war. The first case of polio in 25 years in Gaza could go on and on and on. The evidence is there for everybody to see by independent sources like the United Nations. The evidence is there. So, I mean, if all of that does not mean that sanctions are forthcoming, the question is, what more does it take? So, the first thing the international community should do is get serious in treating Israel like, frankly, a rogue state, and because it is that, in my very strong opinion, because it is committing egregious breaches of international law. And we should, secondly, of course, be continuing to do everything we can to bring about an immediate ceasefire. And it seems to me that the actions that have been taken thus far are simply not good enough because people continue to suffer. In the longer term, because there has to be a longer term resolution, the cycles of violence will continue to perpetuate until we deal with the root cause. And the root cause, without any shadow of a doubt, is that there hasn't been the fulfillment of the promise to the Palestinian people of a sovereign state. I mean, people agree with, often pay lip service to a two-state solution. Impossible to have a two-state solution when you only recognize one state. So you have to have an immediate recognition, not a forthcoming recognition based on some mythical process, but an immediate recognition of the Palestinian state in the way that Ireland, Norway, and Spain have done recently. The entire world, United Kingdom, United States, and all members of the Security Council and United Nations should do so immediately, because only when you fulfill both sides of the equation can you have meaningful progress towards a two-state solution. And the last thing I would say is that international law must be respected. The ICJ investigation that's ongoing into genocide, the ICC, the prosecutors are seeking an arrest warrant. There hasn't been a decision on that yet, but if there is an arrest warrant issued, to be it leaders of Hamas or indeed leaders of the Israeli government, they must be respected. And those that have committed such egregious breaches of international law have to be held to account.
What are your thoughts on the rise of racism and Islamophobia in the UK?
I don't know a single person of colour, and indeed a single Muslim in the United Kingdom that hasn't faced Islamophobia and racism, especially in the last few years, where it seems to have been heightened because of the real I think it's been allowed to flourish on social media platforms, particularly X, formerly known as Twitter. So you have all of this happening, of course, not in a vacuum. You've had years, if not probably decades, of demonization of migrants, demonization of others, xenophobia, anti-Muslim rhetoric. And that's not coming from the fringes, it's coming from very senior sources. I mean, the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, wrote in a national newspaper that Islamists are taking over. I mean, that's a dog whistle of the highest order against Muslims. People like Nigel Farage, who've made a life career out of demonization of Muslims and migrants, is now an elected MP and his party on the rise. So this hasn't happened in a vacuum. Politicians of different administrations for far too long have adopted the language of the far right in our political discourse and our media discourse. And then it takes a tragic and terrible incident like Southport to happen for disinformation to spread right across social media and, of course, spread by the owner of X itself, by many accounts, the wealthiest man in the world, seeking to use his billions to fan the flames of religious and racial intolerance. And we then wake up to mosques being attacked, Black and Asian people being targeted with violence, and hotels with vulnerable people inside attempted to be set ablaze. This didn't happen in a vacuum, and the only way to deal with it is to address the underlying root causes, which, as I say, are the mainstreaming of xenophobia, anti-migrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric in our media and political discourse.
After the racist riots, you said you considered leaving the UK. Was this an emotional or a serious consideration?
Those two aren't mutually exclusive. Things can come from emotion, and you can seriously consider them. And for me, it's about my children's safety. I'm a father to a newborn 6 week old baby. I've got three girls, and can I honestly say that in the future, given that they are of mixed race, they're Scottish Pakistani and Scottish Palestinian parental heritage, can I say for sure with certainty that they would be safe in the UK in the future, that they wouldn't be targeted for attack, that if they went and chose to go to a mosque, that wouldn't be attacked. I can't say that with certainty. It feels like the situation for people of colour, for minorities, and for Muslims in particular, is getting worse, not just in the United Kingdom, I have to say, across much of Europe too. So, look, I don't want to leave. I'm as Scottish as they get. I'm born here, raised here, educated here, of course, led the Scottish government for a period too. I've said before, you cut me open and I'm as Scottish as they come. But for every single parent, you will think about your children's future. And I can't say with certainty that my children would be safe here.
How did this all kind of affect you on a personal level?
Well, I mean, difficult because ultimately, when we strip everything back, politician, former first minister, as I say, I'm a father and a husband first and foremost. Those are the two most important jobs in my life, bar none. I mean, nothing comes close to being as important as being a father and being a husband to my wife. And so when I think about can I keep them safe, and the answer to that is I'm not sure or probably not, then that I think is quite hard to accept from a personal perspective. And as I say, I don't want to leave this country. I love Scotland more than any other country in the entire world. No ifs, buts, or maybes about it. I don't have another home. It's just the only country I call home. It's the only country I will ever call home. So I don't want to leave my home, but I've got to think about the safety of my children. And yeah, that's a tough decision to make and plays heavily on my mind.
Scotland largely avoided the riots. Does this show a sense of togetherness missing in Britain and why?
Two things I would say. One is that we should guard against any Scottish exceptionalism. I mean, I know from first-hand experience, racism, Islamophobia exists in Scotland. Of course, it does exist in virtually every nation in the world. But secondly, we can't dismiss the fact that there wasn't any riots here in Scotland. And I think that's because for the 25 years of devolution, 25 years of having a Scottish Parliament, there's been a general political consensus which says that migration has been good for Scotland and multiculturalism is good for Scotland and is necessary for the future. I mean, we have an aging population. We have areas in Scotland of significant depopulation in our remote, rural, and island communities. Migration is essential. I mean, our economy doesn't survive. Our public services completely collapse without migration. So, for 25 years, the political parties, not just the party I belong to, but right across the political spectrum, even I have to say, including the Scottish Conservatives, there's been a general consensus here that migration should be talked about in a positive manner. And I suppose that's my challenge to the new Prime Minister, to Keir Starmer, is you have a moment here to really reset the narrative on both migration and multiculturalism and say, look, it is good for this country, needed for this country, vital for this country's future prosperity. And that's not diminishing or dismissing the concerns that people have. People have some legitimate concerns around access to housing and public services. But your housing and your public services are not being taken away from you because of the migrant. They've been taken away from you because politicians didn't build enough houses or haven't invested enough in the National Health Service. In fact, if it wasn't for migrants, I suspect our NHS would utterly collapse the next day. So, look, I think it takes honesty from a politician to do that. And my hope is that given 14 years of abject misery under the Conservatives, deceit and lies, that we get far better from the current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer.
You recently had a public row with Elon Musk. Could you tell me more about that?
Elon Musk and I have traded blows before. If Elon Musk thinks that he can buy my silence, intimidate me, use his billions to try to threaten me, it won't work. I mean, I'm going to keep calling him a bigot. I'm going to keep telling him that he is peddling far-right, white supremacist conspiracy theories because that is exactly what he is doing. And he is an extremely dangerous individual, probably, I would suggest, one of the most dangerous men on the planet because what he does is he uses his billions in a completely unaccountable fashion to spread hatred. And that has to be called out. That has to be called out. So I'll keep calling it out. As I say, there's nothing Elon Musk can do. I mean, I can see that my posts on X get less viewings and so on. So he can try to shadow ban or use the algorithm against me, but he won't stop me from talking about the pervasive and nefarious impact that he's had on society.
What do you mean by use his billions to intimidate you?
He can try to use his money to threaten to take me to court, to sue me, to stop me from talking, to he can take me off X, he can shadow ban me, he can make the algorithm work against me. He can do what he wants. I mean, he's a very powerful individual, as I say, by some accounts, and extremely one of the most powerful individuals on the planet, given he's not accountable and clearly has extreme and extraordinary wealth. So he can try to do that any way that he wishes, but it just won't work.
You urged Prime Minister Keir Starmer to regulate misinformation on social media. How important is this issue to you?
First, I'm a proponent of free speech, but free speech is not absolute. It never has been absolute. You should not be able to go into a packed theatre and shout fire because of the chaos and panic and injury and possibly death that it might well cause in the ensuing stampede. So there has always been limits on free speech. There should always be limits on free speech, and those limits are there to be debated and discussed. But what we can't have is the clear incitement of racial and religious hatred going unchecked. And that is what has happened. And Elon Musk has amplified it, used his platform with what he himself has 193 million followers or something there or thereabouts. And he is using that platform to, as I say, amplify white supremacy, far right conspiracies. Now, as I've already referenced, we wouldn't allow that to happen on a soapbox in Hyde Park. Why on earth would we allow somebody to get on their soapbox on X and really propagate, advocate, and articulate such blatant racism, Islamophobia, and hatred?
What are your proudest moments during your time as First Minister and in politics?
If you look domestically, I was really proud of bringing forward, progressive taxation. Progressive taxation means that those who earn the most pay more because we invest that in our public services. And I was proud to be able to make those decisions so that we can invest in things like the Scottish Child Payment. The Scottish Child Payment is a unique payment to Scotland. It goes, as the name suggests, to Scotland's vulnerable children, and has helped, by some estimates, lift almost 100,000 children out of poverty this year alone. So it's a really powerful tool, really powerful measure that we have to our hands and to our fingertips. So really proud to have made sure the investment was available for that through progressive taxation. There's lots of things domestically that I could point to that I'm really proud of. I suppose on the international stage, giving a voice to the voiceless in Gaza for me is was exceptionally important. As I said, there was no other European leader willing to stick their head above the parapet and call for a ceasefire. They just weren't willing to do so. And I know a number of leaders have, who I interacted with and I know well, told me afterwards that because I was able to do so, that they were able to come in the back of it and call for immediate ceasefire too. So I'm really proud of the role that I was able to play as First Minister on the global stage in that sense. That's one I will continue to raise my voice for, regardless of being First Minister or not.
How are you feeling since resigning?
Look, you'll always miss the job. Being First Minister is wonderful. Being leader of the country that is your home is wonderful. But it is a very stressful existence, as you can imagine. So not having that stress is great. And genuinely, I mean, not every politician that stands down says this, but genuinely being able to spend time with my family at a time when I've got a new addition to the family has been great. When I've done school runs and school pickups and get to spend time with a newborn baby in a way that I probably couldn't have done if I was still First Minister. And then there's the question of what I choose to do next. I mean, I'm still elected until 2026, and I'll make a decision about whether I stand again next year. But there is now time to look at what else I can do in the world. Where else can I make a contribution? And I'm really excited for the first time in probably 13 years, I'm able to say, well, what is it I want to do next? And that's quite an exciting kind of conversation to have.
What's next for you? Could we see you as Scotland's First Minister again?
I'm not angling to be First Minister again. I've kind of done that, been there, done that, and got the T-shirt. So I'm happy to have played the role as First Minister and making history while doing so. But I don't intend on coming back as First Minister. I was going to say anytime soon, anytime, full stop. In terms of what I do next, I reference I'm still a member of the Scottish Parliament until 2026, and I'll make a decision about whether I seek another term probably some point next year. That'll be discussions that I have with my wife and primarily, and also close trusted friends of mine. And then what I do next, there's probably two areas I'd like to focus on. One is combating the far right and extremism. I think that has to be done. Those that have been riding a wave of populism that is driven by extremism, particularly anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe and the West, that has to be confronted. Otherwise, we end up in a dismal situation where not just me, but 25 million Muslims across Europe will just walk up and get up and leave if they don't feel their families are safe here. And that would be, Europe would be poorer for it. So tackling the far right for me is really important. And then on the international stage, seeing where I can continue to make a contribution, particularly I'd like to see if I can get involved in areas of humanitarian diplomacy, areas of focusing on conflict resolution, and that's particularly close to me, given that so much conflict is happening in Muslim countries, and being somebody who is Muslim and proud to be Muslim, that pains me greatly. So, can I play a role in helping to reduce that conflict, prevent conflict in the first instance, but certainly trying to mediate in that conflict where it's happening. So, those are a couple of areas that I've got a real interest in. But as I say, goodness knows where life will take me next.
Is there anything you would like to tell our readers in the Arab world and afar?
All I would say is this is a really, I think, critical juncture, a really important time. And it's so important that we, all of us, I think particularly in the Arab world and beyond, that we nurture and invest in the next generation of leadership. And we make sure that next generation of leadership is values based. So we have this huge rising tide of populism. And populism at its most basic is somebody who presents a very simple solution to a very complex problem. And when they do that, they'll usually jump on whatever kind of bandwagon it is to present those problems, those solutions to those problems. And ultimately, that is somebody who's not based in any values or rooted in any values. So if we can ensure the next generation of leadership is rooted in values, inclusive values that bring people together, that respect and celebrate multiculturalism and the plurality of the world that we live in, as opposed to being insular, then I think that is where we all have to invest. Now, I want to play a role in that, but I think for every Arab leader across the world, I would say, look, you've got to be thinking about investing in the next generation of leadership, and that their leadership is values based.